can't kill Nintendo. Nintendo will live on. Sega tried to kill Nintendo, but they failed as they were BTF. Oh. Sony tried to kill Nintendo, but they failed as they looked times for a bunch of crap. Xbox tried to kill Nintendo. They failed as they had no Japan sales.
I suppose I need to make my opinion on this situation clear because it's one of those things that I've always felt, even back in 2014 when Jim abandoned us to go do his little internet blood sports thing. The reality is Gamergate is an interesting phenomenon because gamers are fed up, we're upset. There's clearly issues in the gaming industry. We're talking about those issues. Gamergate was the incident where it all blew up. And Gamergate 2.0 came about because those issues were never resolved. However, the thing I'm noticing over and over and over again is that nobody is talking about the real problem. Right? What is the real problem in video games, right? Every single time, this happened back when the original Gamergate 2, people really get upset over the silliest things that don't really amount to anything, right? This is very clear, I think, with how apparent it's been that about how the Coomers have co-opted Gamergate both times, right? So with Gamergate 1, what happened with it is that eventually, the grifters got bored of it and moved on to the next big thing. But like then the Coomers took over and started complaining about localization in Nintendo games, right? Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Xenoblade Chronicles X, Fire Emblem Fates, right? Nintendo games were slandered for a brief period of time because of Gamergate. And of course, this was all very unfair. And at the time, I was like focusing very heavily on talking about like why these people were so terrible. But now we're seeing the same thing happen again, right? We are seeing like, people hype up Nikke. We're seeing people hype up Stellar Blade. We're seeing people like rage over like localization changes in newer versions of games. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door are cheap examples. And to me, this demonstrates, I think, the reality of these kind of controversies. When it comes to the Coomers, when it comes to the purists, nobody cares. You know, People love to pretend that like, the backlash to Tokyo Mirage Sessions is why it bombed, as opposed to being like a niche RPG in the West, right? That why didn't Fire Emblem Fates fail? Why didn't Engage fail? Why didn't Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door fail? Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door and Fire Emblem Three Houses are the best-selling titles in their respective series now. The reality is Nintendo is on such a higher plane of existence to other companies that a simple line change is not going to ruin the entire experience for anyone, right? No matter how woke it is or no matter what they try to do, the reality is the core experience of the Thousand Year Door is never going to be like on the same level as Star Wars The Acolyte or Star Trek Picard or whatever like new woke like nonsense is coming out, Doctor Who, right? The reality is we're nowhere near that level. And yet you're seeing people like incessantly complain about random line changes. It's ridiculous, right? It is absurd, and it kind of has led me down this realization, right? This the reality that we're in now, today. People have lost sight of what Gamergate should be about, right? Like, not that like we ever really had a very clear consensus, because I think I was the only person who was like openly focused on like the real goal, that companies should be producing good video games, right? It doesn't matter what their politics are. It doesn't matter like what country of origin they're from. It doesn't matter what platform they're on. The goal should be to produce good video games, right? But the thing I noticed, especially back in 2014, was that people were very eager to downplay the fact that Nintendo was clearly leagues ahead of the rest of the industry when it came to very simple things. Having a stable 40-hour work week, not laying people off after every project, producing reasonably powered hardware that was affordable to consumers while still maintaining a high profit margin, having shorter development time cycles for games, right? Developing games for multiple different audiences, having different genres and franchises instead of like hyper focusing on like one specific demographic, right? The things that people are talking about now that other companies aren't doing, Nintendo was doing a long time ago and still continues to this day, right? And the thing is, the real problem with the gaming industry, and this has been going on since the 90s at least, is that the industry does not like admitting that Nintendo is a company worth emulating, right? Everybody else is chasing trends and trying to make gas a thing and yes, getting on board with current year political topics. But the reality is they have not spent the past 25 years cultivating talent. They have not spent the past 25 years building new interesting IPs, doing things, new and interesting things with existing IPs, right? Keeping old favorites relevant with high quality remakes, right? Just compare the Thousand Year Door versus Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? The woke aspects of both games have nothing to do with how each were received, right? The issue is with Final Fantasy VII-R is that it is not something that the fans wanted. It doesn't appeal to newer fans, people who never played the original. It's just not a well-produced product in general. While the Thousand Year Door was a much more faithful recreation of what the original Thousand Year Door was like. Some misgivings aside, right? And to me, like it's obvious that the Thousand Year Door was a far more successful re-release than Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? But here you have people still trying to continue this farce that like Nintendo Treehouse is ruining games when really that's just not the case at all, right? When I look back at the past decade, a decade ago, Destiny came out, right? It was a huge flop on release. Everyone hated it, but the gaming media did everything in its power to try and make it look like a huge success. It wasn't until just recently that people began to realize that like Bungie had no idea what they were doing. They got acquired by Sony and like they laid a bunch of people off. They keep getting involved in controversy after controversy after controversy. Bungie is never going to relive like the Halo glory days, right? People are only just now acknowledging that. But who was there telling you this in 2014? It was me. Okay. I didn't have a YouTube channel then. I was commenting on blogs that nobody reads, but I was telling you Destiny is a huge disaster and nobody is admitting it, right? To me, that was the real spirit of Gamergate, right? That the gaming industry bends over backwards to protect certain properties for business reasons, while good games, stuff like the wonderful 101, the Wii U console as a whole, go completely unappreciated and ignored for petty reasons. And that has continued to this day, even though people don't really don't buy into the nonsense as much as they used to, right? Just look at like the turning point. I think The Last of Us Part Two, right? The original Last of Us is the last AAA product that released before Gamergate, right? So back when it came out, people were doing this thing where they're just like, oh, based. This is one of the best games ever made, one of the best stories ever told in gaming, blah, blah, blah. And then the sequel comes out and it's complete crap. Everyone sees right through it, right? It pulls all these hackneyed story elements. There's all these problems with The Last of Us Part 2. And the people delusionally have push this farce that like, oh, Neil Druckmann didn't work on the original, he came in and took over, part two is so bad because of him specifically, the rest of Naughty Dog is a good studio. In reality, Naughty Dog was never good. The Last of Us was always this way, Okay, it's not anything new or different. You know, I keep seeing this like uh weird conspiracy theory that Amy Hennig wrote like the original Last of Us. First of all, Amy Hennig is not a good writer. But and second of all, like it's not true. So like to me, it seems like people were making excuses for the original Last of Us, you know, trying to blame one guy for the issues that the series had gone down. And we're seeing this with like other brands too, you know, Star Wars being the chief example with Kathleen Kennedy. Yeah, let's ignore all like the other executives at Disney that are causing these problems. Let's ignore Bob Iger. Let's ignore like their long history of pulling stunts like this. Let's ignore like every every person responsible for this and just hyper focus on like Kathleen Kennedy. Okay. Like the reality is, if Star Wars, if you want to stop, like if you don't like where Star Wars is going, don't watch it. You know, there's far too much good stuff to watch, read, and play to worry about like what some hack fraud is doing with some established IP. You know, like why obsess over Star Wars? Why like endlessly consume new content when it isn't good? Like to me, it just doesn't make any sense. It feels like to me that the people who get hung up on people like Kathleen Kennedy, bad shows being produced, and like localization issues, you know, like the whole like with what happened with Paper Mario, like I think they're just grifters, right? I think these people have no real interest in the products or what's being made or like good video games. I think they're just opportunists who are just latching onto a trend. Like the fact that audiences don't like this stuff and that they can grift off of it by just, you know, telling you over and over again like just how bad it is now while ignoring all the good stuff that exists, right? Like to me, I do think like this is the major thing of the major failure of Gamergate is hyper focusing too much on political issues, focusing too much on those evil SJWs while refusing to acknowledge the very real reality that like these businesses, this industry was poorly constructed from from the start, right? These executives have no background in games. They have no idea what they're doing. They don't know how to make good products. It has nothing to do with like the evil feminists. The reality is this was an issue even back in the mid 2000s, which you guys love to LARP, like love to hype up as being the golden age, but in reality, it was like a pretty sharp decline from what we were getting in the 90s, right? Again, even back then, we were getting like more of a focus on story and visuals over like interesting, good gameplay, right? But again, it's one of those things. Like again, like who in the industry was better than Iwata, right? Who innovated more than he did? Who led his company into dominating the gaming sphere the way Iwata did? Nobody, right? Nobody did that. Iwata is the greatest CEO in gaming history, right? Like bar none. And yet, like during his entire tenure, like people just whined and complained, like, PlayStation, it's so much better. No, it wasn't. It wasn't better then, and it wasn't better now. All you're doing is that you've gotten older, and you're starting to realize that like the things that you thought were so cool growing up aren't all that great. But instead of like acknowledging that like they're that you need to move on with your life and like just kind of forget about you know, this piece of entertainment, you obsess over it. You make it your entire identity. You revolve your entire life around gaming when really it's not something worth saving, honestly. Like if you don't enjoy video games, if you don't enjoy what the modern Western video game industry is doing, like why are you so adamantly supporting everything it does? You know, why are you so religiously obsessed with Valve and PC gaming and gaming YouTubers when like nothing is really coming out right now? You know, like to me, it just again, I do think we're unconsciously gamer culture is kind of moving in this direction where like we need to just ignore the gaming media, ignore game award shows, ignore Metacritic scores, ignore like YouTubers in general. Like we're slowly moving in that direction, all right? like people have talked about this, how like gaming culture seems like it's going downhill. I think it's a good thing. You know, like people always talk about like how SJWs have infiltrated gamer culture, but in reality, it was always kind of trashy. You know, like there was no golden age of like gamer culture, like sitting around talking about how great like games were. No, back in the 90s, like people were screaming at you about how Sega was better. You know, like again, it was completely delusional and out of touch with reality. But again, it always the community has always had this very immature edge to it, and it's definitely something that I think we need to leave in the past. Right? We need to grow up and acknowledge that, like, you know, people with different worldviews exist, and we can have different perspectives on things. Right? Like, I don't think necessarily that we should like rally against the evil SJWs, rally against like localization just because the community told us to. Like I don't respect you. Like I don't care what you have to say. I don't I know too much about the industry and the games, and I enjoy them too much to ever listen to you. Like to me, I see these people as posers, right? I really do. I always have, but it's becoming more and more clear to me now that um, we need to move past this mindset, right? We need to move past this idea that we need to like politically gatekeep games. Okay? Like let developers make what they want. Like what is so difficult to understand about that concept, right? Like why exactly are we expected to get angry every time Nintendo does something or releases some game or like you know, I saw people get angry at like Princess Peach's box art being changed and like thought it was some like woke agenda. Like that was fucking stupid. Okay. That was completely out of touch with reality. And yeah, I do think at this point that like the censor shitters, right? The anti woke woke crowd, the grifters, they are officially worse than the SJWs, right? Say what you will about like, you know, Jamie Markey or like whoever, but like, you know, Nick Rekieta, the base dread lawyer, you know, like he just got arrested. You know, like honestly, like I have a lot more contempt for Rekieta and his ilk, you know, the people who are doing damage control for him right now than I do like any of his opposition. You know, even back when like he was making fun of Ron Soye and like Jack Murphy, I was telling people that like this is ridiculous. You don't need to focus on these nobodies. Focus on like actually doing good, interesting content. But he didn't do it because he at his core, he was just a grifter.